Greetings everyone, we're gathered here to figure out WTF was, is, or will be. HMS Rodney, let's dive in. HMS Rodney was one of two battleships from the Nelson class built for the Royal Navy in the 1920s. She began her service in 1928 and spent most of her peacetime years with the Atlantic and Home Fleet. At times, she even served as a flagship while her sister ship, HMS Nelson, underwent repairs. In the early days of World War II, Rodney hunted for German commerce raiders, took part in the Norwegian campaign, and protected convoys crossing the Atlantic. But her most notable achievement came in 1941 when she played a key role in sinking the German battleship Bismarck. Following a short refit in the United States, Rodney was back in action, escorting convoys to Malta and assisting the Allies in their invasion of French Algeria during Operation Torch in late 1942. In 1943, she supported the invasions of Sicily and Italy. When the Normandy Landings began in June 1944, Rodney provided crucial naval gunfire, continuing her support during later operations around Seine. Later that year, Rodney also escorted an Arctic convoy to the Soviet Union. However, after years of hard service and limited repairs, she was placed in reserve in late 1945, and by 1948 she was scrapped. Background and description. The Nelson-class battleships, including HMS Rodney, were a more compact design compared to the larger G3 battlecruisers. The G3 class had been cancelled because they exceeded the limits set by the Washington Naval Treaty in 1922. Proved just 6 months after the treaty, the Nelson-class ships were armed with powerful 16-inch guns, designed to match the firepower of American Colorado and Japanese Nagato battleships, while staying within the 35,000-ton displacement limit. HMS Rodney measured 660 feet in length between the perpendiculars and had an overall length of just over 710 feet. She was 106 feet wide, with a draft of 30 feet at a standard load. At her standard weight, Rodney displaced about 33,730 tons. Fully loaded, she reached around 37,430 tons. Her crew varied between 1,361 when she served as a flagship and 1,314 when she was not. The ship was driven by two Brown Curtis geared steam turbines, each connected to a single shaft, powered by 8 Admiralty 3-drum boilers. These turbines produced 45,000 horsepower, giving Rodney a top speed of 23 knots. During sea trials in September 1927, she achieved a slightly higher speed of 23.8 knots. She had enough fuel to travel 7,000 nautical miles at a cruising speed of 16 knots, making her well-suited for long voyages. Armament and fire control. In February 1942, a 16-inch gun was being installed in the A turret, HMS Rodney. The Nelson-class battleships were equipped with a main battery of 9 16-inch breech-loading guns, arranged in 3 triple turrets, positioned forward of the superstructure. These turrets were labeled A, B, and X, with B turret firing over the others. As for the secondary armament, each ship had 12 6-inch guns, placed in twin turrets at the rear, with 3 turrets on each side of the ship. For anti-aircraft defense, Rodney was outfitted with 6 4.7-inch guns mounted individually, as well as 8 2-pounder guns. The ship also had 2 24.5-inch torpedo tubes submerged on each side, angled slightly outward from the center line. Rodney's fire control system featured 2 main directors equipped with 15-foot rangefinders. One director was located above the bridge, and the other was positioned at the rear of the superstructure. Each turret also had its own 41-foot rangefinder. Secondary guns were controlled by 4 directors with 12-foot rangefinders, 2 near the bridge and 2 at the back of the ship. Anti-aircraft guns were managed by directors located behind the main armament director. All torpedo control directors were placed near the funnel, each equipped with 15-foot rangefinders. Protection. The Nelson-class ships were built with a 14-inch thick, Krupp-cemented armor belt along the waterline between the main gun barbettes. This armor was reduced to 13 inches over the engine and boiler rooms, as well as the 6-inch magazine. The belt was inclined at an 18-degree angle to better protect against plunging fire. Transverse bulkheads sealed off the ends of the armored citadel, with thicknesses ranging from 8 to 12 inches at the front and 4 to 10 inches at the rear. The turrets had 16-inch thick armor at the front, with sides between 9 and 11 inches thick, and the roofs measured 7.25 inches. The armor on the barbettes ranged from 12 to 15 inches. The armored deck of Rodney was positioned on top of the belt with varying thicknesses, 6.25 inches over the main gun magazines and 3.75 inches above the propulsion machinery and secondary magazine. Toward the stern, an additional armored deck protected the steering gear with 4.25-inch thick plating. Awning tower had armor ranging from 12 to 14 inches thick, a 6.5-inch thick roof. Secondary gun turrets were shielded by armor between 1 and 1.5 inches thick. Rodney's underwater defenses included a double bottom that was 5 feet deep and a torpedo protection system made up of an empty watertight compartment followed by a water-filled compartment. This system had a total depth of 12 feet and was reinforced by a 1.5-inch thick torpedo bulkhead. Design deficiencies. The Nelson-class battleships, including HMS Rodney, were innovative but had limitations due to the strict restrictions of the Washington Naval Treaty. Designers had to balance the inclusion of 16-inch guns with a 35,000-ton displacement cap, making weight saving a major priority. Eustace Tennyson Dyncourt, the director of naval construction, even told the ship's designer, Edward Atwood, that everything had to be minimized to meet the weight limit. These compromises led to issues, especially for Rodney. While HMS Nelson received several refits, which improved her performance, Rodney was not as fortunate. As naval architect David K. Brown observed, the ship's structure may not have been strong enough to handle the challenges. Rodney's lighter machinery, compared to Nelson's, caused persistent problems. Rodney's endurance became a growing concern as time went on. During her chase of the Bismarck in 1941, she nearly had to abandon the pursuit due to fuel shortages. British designers later referenced these problems when setting endurance requirements for the battleship Vanguard. Over time, Rodney suffered from leaks, with significant issues emerging in 1940, 1941, and again in 1944. In one severe storm, the leaking was so extensive that it overwhelmed a 50-ton pump. Despite a refit in Boston in 1941, problems like defective riveting and other structural flaws continued. By 1943, officials recognized that Rodney needed a complete modernization, but she never received the necessary upgrades, leaving her unfit for service by the end of 1944. Modifications. Rodney saw several modifications over her career. Starting in 1930, with a replacement of the high-angle directors and rangefinder platform by a new circular platform for the high-angle control system, axe director. By 1932, 2-pounder guns and a starboard torpedo director were replaced by an octuple 2-pounder mount near the funnel, with a rangefinder added at the back of the bridge. Later, the port side received similar modifications. In 1934 and 1935, Rodney gained 2 quadruple mounts for Vickers point-inch anti-aircraft guns. An aircraft catapult was installed on X turret, and a collapsible crane was added to lift aircraft in and out of the water. The Fairey Swordfish torpedo bomber, first used, was soon replaced by a Supermarine Walrus amphibian. By 1938, another octuple pom-pom was installed, and Rodney became the first battleship to be equipped with a Type 79Y early warning radar. During a brief refit in 1940, Rodney's radar was upgraded. 2 20mm Oerlikon anti-aircraft guns were installed on B turret. When the ship was refitted in Boston in 1941, the Oerlikons were replaced by a quadruple 2-pounder mount, and 2 octuple mounts were fitted where the aft 6-inch gunnery directors had been. She also received a full radar suite upgrade, including a Type 281 radar and a Type 284 gunnery radar. Additional Oerlikon guns were added during a 1942 refit, reinforcing her anti-aircraft defenses with a total of 17 single mounts. Pom-pom directors were replaced with new models equipped with Type 282 fire control radars. A number of new radar systems were also installed. Rodney continued to see further modifications throughout 1943 and 1944. The shields were added to her 4.7-inch guns, and the catapult on X turret was removed. By mid-1943, she had been fitted with more Oerlikon mounts, bringing her total to 67. A Ahead of the Normandy landings in 1944, a Type 650 radio jammer was installed, further increasing her displacement to over 43,100 tons and her crew to between 1,631 and 1,650 men. Construction and career. HMS Rodney, named after Admiral Lord George Rodney, was the 6th Royal Navy ship to bear the name. Laid down on December 28, 1922 as part of the 1922 naval program, she was constructed at Camel Laird's shipyard in Birkenhead. Rodney was launched on December 17, 1925, by Princess Mary, Viscountess Lascelles, though it took her 3 tries to break the ceremonial bottle of Imperial Burgundy. The ship was completed by August 1927 and was commissioned on December 7 under the command of Captain Henry Kitsa, costing £7,607,799. Rodney and her sister ship, Nelson, quickly gained nicknames such as Rodnall and Nelsol due to their distinctive designs. Other nicknames included the Queen's Mansions for their resemblance to a block of flats, and the Cherry Tree class, because they were cut down by the Washington Naval Treaty. Rodney's official trials ended in March 1928, and she formally entered service in the 2nd Battle Squadron of the Atlantic Fleet. In 1929, Rodney participated in fleet maneuvers involving both the Atlantic and Mediterranean fleets. Later that year, the ship was ordered to aid 2 submarines that had collided off Milford Haven, Wales. Steaming at full speed, Rodney reached the area but was too late to rescue the survivors of the H-47 submarine. By late 1929, Rodney's propulsion machinery had become unreliable, prompting a refit lasted through the rest of the year. Captain Andrew Cunningham took over command from Captain Francis Tottenham in December 1929. During 1930, Rodney sailed to Northern Ireland, where a street in Portrush was named in her honor. Later that year, she made a special voyage to Iceland to commemorate the 1,000-year anniversary of the Icelandic Parliament. Captain Roger Bellairs replaced Cunningham in December. A year later, Rodney's crew participated in the Invergordon Mutiny of September 1931, protesting pay cuts by refusing orders to sail. While the mutiny ended after several days, the Admiralty was displeased with how Bellairs managed the situation, leading to his replacement by Captain John Tovey in April 1932. In 1934, after HMS Nelson ran aground, Rodney briefly became the fleet flagship and participated in the winter cruise to the West Indies. The ship visited Norwegian ports before returning home. Captain Wilfred Custance took command of Rodney in August 1934, and during the winter of 1935, the ship made another voyage to the West Indies, before visiting the Azores and Gibraltar. In 1936, Rodney took part in King George V's Silver Jubilee Fleet Review at Spithead, and later served as the Royal Guard ship during Cowes Week. Captain Ronald Halifax replaced Custance in July 1936. In 1937, members of Rodney's crew traveled to London for the coronation of King George VI. Rodney participated in the Fleet Review in May and then became the temporary fleet flagship during Nelson's extended refit. Admiral Sir Roger Backhouse raised his flag aboard Rodney during this period, and the ship made a visit to Oslo, Norway. After Nelson's refit ended in 1938, 2 ships visited Lisbon, Portugal. Captain Edward Seifert took command of Rodney in August 1938, just before the ship's annual refit in September. In early 1939, Rodney returned to service and Rear Admiral Lancelot Holland assumed command of the 2nd Battle Squadron aboard the ship. In March, Rodney fired a 21-gun salute in honor of French President Albert Lebrun's arrival in Dover. However, as tensions rose with Germany in mid-1939, Rodney developed steering issues and had to undergo repairs at Rosyth. Second World War 1939. When Britain declared war on Nazi Germany on September 3, 1939, HMS Rodney and the rest of the Home Fleet were already patrolling the waters between Iceland, Norway, and Scotland, searching for German blockade runners. From September 6 to 10, they focused on patrolling the Norwegian coast. On September 24th, the British submarine Spearfish, operating in the Heligoland Bight, was heavily damaged by German depth charges. Unable to dive, Spearfish called for help. The fleet responded, sending 2 destroyers to escort her back, while the rest of the fleet provided cover. During this operation, 5 German bombers attacked the fleet. However, Rodney's radar detected the planes early, and no damage was inflicted. In October, Rodney was part of the covering force for an iron ore convoy from Narvik, Norway. On November 21st, Captain Frederick Dalrymple Hamilton replaced Captain Sifret. 2 days later, after the armed merchant cruiser Rawalpindi was sunk by the German battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau off Iceland, Rodney and the home fleet went in search of them. However, severe weather allowed the German ships to evade capture and return to Germany. On November 29th, Rodney developed serious rudder problems and had to return to Liverpool, steering only with her engines. Repairs took until the end of December 1940. In December 1939, HMS Nelson was severely damaged by a mine, so Rodney temporarily took on the role of fleet flagship until Nelson returned in August. Rodney spent much of January and February 1940 anchored, with occasional missions to protect convoys from commerce raiders. During one such mission on February 21st, heavy weather caused Rodney's steering issues to resurface, forcing her return to Greenock. 6 days later, King George VI and Queen Elizabeth visited the ship as part of their morale-boosting tour of Scottish shipyards. In March, Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, boarded Rodney for a journey to Scapa Flow. Although based there with the home fleet, Rodney narrowly escaped damage during a German air attack on March 16th. On April 7th, word reached the home fleet that the Royal Air Force had attacked German warships in the North Sea. Admiral Sir Charles Forbes, fleet's commander-in-chief, ordered the fleet to sea that evening. 2 days later, on April 9th, Rodney was hit by a 100-pound bomb off Norway's southwest coast. The bomb broke apart after striking an armored ammunition box on deck. While the fragments penetrated several decks, they eventually bounced off the 4-inch armored deck, causing a small fire in the galley. The explosion wounded 3 men and injured 15 others with electrical burns when water from fire hoses hit a junction box. Temporary repairs were made, and the ship continued operations until anchoring at Scapa Flow on April 17. In June, after receiving reports of German ships spotted in the Norwegian Sea, the home fleet, including Rodney, set out to protect Allied troop convoys evacuating from Norway. Rodney's role as the home fleet flagship ended on July 24th when Nelson returned. The ship was then moved to Rosyth on August 23rd, with orders to attack the German invasion fleet in the English Channel, should Operation Celian proceed. She returned to Scapa Flow in November to begin convoy escort duties. Following the sinking of the armed merchant cruiser Jervis Bay by the German heavy cruiser Admiral Scheer, Rodney and her sister ship Nelson were deployed to the gap between Iceland and the Faroe Islands to prevent the German ship from returning home. In December, Rodney was assigned to escort convoy HX-93 from Halifax, Nova Scotia, back to the UK. From December 6 to 8, Rodney encountered a fierce storm that caused leaks in her hull, resulting in some flooding. Repairs started at Rosyth on December 18, reinforcing her hull and other structural elements. 1941. After completing her refit on January 13, 1941, HMS Rodney joined the search for the German battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. Despite the efforts, the hunt proved unsuccessful. Shortly after, from February 12 to 23, Rodney escorted convoy HX-108 across the Atlantic. On March 16, while escorting convoy HX-14 in the North Atlantic, Rodney spotted Gneisenau. The German battleship was in the process of rescuing survivors from the burning merchant ship Chilean Reefer, which had been sailing independently. As Rodney appeared on the horizon, her guns were almost within range. Gneisenau was approximately 17 to 18 miles away. Partially hidden behind the smoke of the burning ship and silhouetted by the setting sun, the German ship remained a difficult target. Captain Dalrymple Hamilton chose not to pursue Gneisenau as she turned away at full speed, capable of 31 knots. Instead, Rodney rescued 27 survivors and recovered the bodies of 2 dead seamen from one of the lifeboats before rejoining her convoy. On April 10th, troop convoy TC-10 departed Halifax with a strong escort, including HMS Rodney. However, on April 19th, as the battleship was steaming south of the River Clyde, a tragic accident occurred. Rodney accidentally collided with and sank the armed trawler Topaz. Nearby destroyers were able to rescue only 4 survivors. In some reports, the number of survivors is even fewer, with some stating that none survived the accident. Bismarck on May 22, 1941, HMS Rodney, along with 4 destroyers, escorted the ocean liner MV Britannic as she headed to Halifax. Rodney was scheduled to continue on to Boston for repairs and a refit. Along with materials for her refit, such as boiler tubes and octuple pom-pom mounts, she carried several crates of the Parthenon marbles and 521 military passengers. An American naval attaché was also on board, transporting important documents back to the U.S. Britannic was carrying civilians to Canada and would later return with Canadian troops and airmen bound for Britain. However, events changed course after Bismarck sank the British battlecruiser Hood on May 24 during the Battle of Denmark Strait. Rodney was ordered by the Admiralty to join the pursuit of Bismarck, leaving Britannic under the protection of the destroyer Eskimo. Rodney, along with the destroyers Somali, Mashona, and Tartar, set out to find the German battleship. Early on May 25, after the cruiser Suffolk lost radar contact with Bismarck, Captain Dalrymple Hamilton, consulting with his officers and the American attaché, surmised that Bismarck was likely headed for Brest. Rodney turned east, pushing her speed to 22 knots, surpassing her usual limit, but at the cost of several mechanical failures. Later that morning, Admiral Sir John Tovey aboard King George V mistakenly ordered all ships to head northwest, believing Bismarck was heading in that direction. Knowing Rodney couldn't match Bismarck's speed, Dalrymple Hamilton ignored the order. By 1140, the Admiralty confirmed that Bismarck was likely heading for Brest or Saint-Nazaire, and Rodney turned southeast to cut off the German battleship. After hours of searching and missing her by just 25 miles, Dalrymple Hamilton headed directly toward Brest in the hopes of intercepting. On May 26th, Bismarck was spotted by a RAF Catalina flying boat, and Rodney, now joined by King George Fuss, began closing in. That afternoon, the aircraft carrier Ark Royal launched an airstrike of 14 Swordfish torpedo bombers, mistakenly attacking the cruiser Sheffield. Later that day, a second wave of Swordfish, equipped with contact detonators, managed to strike Bismarck with 3 torpedoes, one of which crippled her steering. As night fell, Admiral Tovey slowed the fleet to conserve fuel, allowing a final confrontation at dawn. At 8:44 a.m. on May 27th, Rodney spotted Bismarck and within minutes opened fire. First few salvos missed, but by 9:02, Rodney had knocked out Bismarck's forward guns, severely damaging her bridge. Bismarck was unable to land any hits in return. As Rodney closed in, she maneuvered to bring her X-turret into action. Although she exposed herself to Bismarck's aft turrets, the German ship only managed to straddle her with fire. As the distance narrowed, Rodney began firing torpedoes, and by 9:31, combined firepower of Rodney, King George V, and the cruisers Norfolk and Dorsetshire had disabled all of Bismarck's main guns. Rodney closed to point-blank range, unleashing full broadsides and launching more torpedoes, one of which may have struck Bismarck. Naval historian Ludovic Kennedy noted this as possibly the only instance of a battleship torpedoing another in history. Rodney fired 378 16-inch and 706 6-inch shells during the engagement. By 10:16, Dalrymple Hamilton ordered a ceasefire, and Dorsetshire finished off Bismarck with torpedoes. Ironically, Rodney sustained more damage from her own low-elevation gunfire than from the German ship. The force of her salvos depressed deck plates and cracked structural supports around the main turrets, while piping and water mains also suffered damage. One gun in A turret broke down permanently, and 2 others in B turret temporarily failed. With fuel running low, Rodney and King George V were ordered to return home. They were briefly attacked by Luftwaffe bombers the next day, but escaped unharmed. Rodney arrived in Greenock on May 29th to refuel and restock supplies, departing for Halifax on June 4th with the ocean liner Windsor Castle. After reaching Boston on June 12th, Rodney underwent extensive repairs for several months, fixed both the damage sustained in battle and long-standing issues with her propulsion. During this period, much of the crew was given leave. Captain James Rivet Carnac replaced Dalrymple Hamilton, and by August 20th, Rodney had departed Boston for Bermuda to resume her training. By late September, she arrived in Gibraltar to join Force H and subsequent operations. Later that day, HMS Rodney departed Gibraltar to join her sister ship, Nelson, in escorting a convoy to Malta during Operation Halberd. During the operation, there was an unfortunate incident where Rodney accidentally shot down a Fleet Air Arm Ferry Fulmar fighter. Nelson was also torpedoed during this mission. Though she managed to stay with the convoy for a time, Nelson eventually had to turn back on September 28, 1941, followed by Rodney and Prince of Wales. With Nelson out of action and returning for repairs, Vice Admiral James Somerville transferred his flag to Rodney on September 30th. However, Rodney's time with Force H was short-lived. Her only other mission with the group involved escorting 2 carriers as they launched fighters for Malta from October 16 to 19. By the end of the month, on October 30th, Rodney was ordered to return to Britain to replace Prince of Wales in the home fleet, as there was concern that the battleship Tirpitz might attempt to break out into the North Atlantic. Rodney set sail on November 2nd, arriving at Loch Ewe, Scotland, 6 days later. After quickly offloading passengers and replenishing supplies, the battleship departed for Hvalfjord, Iceland, where she arrived on November 12th. The highlight of this brief stay in Iceland came when movie star Douglas Fairbanks Jr., who was stationed on an American battleship in the area, paid a visit to Rodney. The ship was later transferred to Scapa Flow in late December. However, by mid-January 1942, Rodney was sent back to Hvalfjord, where she was briefly used as a target ship for training U.S. Army Air Force aviators. 1942. On February 10, 1942, HMS Rodney was ordered to Birkenhead for a refit before moving to Liverpool, where she remained until May 5th. She then returned to Scapa Flow to resume operations alongside her sister ship, Nelson. The 2 battleships began escorting convoy WS-19, which carried troops bound for Egypt and Burma, on June 4th. They traveled as far south as the coast of Portuguese Angola before turning back on June 26. The next day, Rodney's steering began acting up despite earlier repairs, and by July 1st, the ships reached Freetown, Sierra Leone, where Rodney docked for additional fixes. She departed on July 17th, but her steering problems resurfaced, and by July 26, she arrived at Scapa Flow, where her crew cleaned the boilers and requested further assistance from Rosyth Dockyard to address the ongoing issues. On August 2nd, Rodney left Scapa with new orders for convoy escort duties, but was soon diverted to become part of the close escort for convoy WS-21S, bound for Malta during Operation Pedestal. Vice Admiral Sir Bruce Fraser, second in command of the home fleet, joined Rodney to gain experience in coordinating carrier and convoy operations, though he was not flying his flag aboard the ship. After rendezvousing with the convoy on August 4th, Rodney was assigned to Force Z, which was scheduled to turn back before the convoy passed through the Sicilian Narrows. On August 10th, Italian spies in Spain spotted the convoy as it moved through the Strait of Gibraltar. The next day, Axis forces began their assault on the convoy. The German submarine U-73 struck first, sinking the carrier Eagle. Later that evening, Rodney herself was attacked by 2 bombers that narrowly missed her with 2 bombs and a torpedo. She skillfully dodged 2 more torpedoes dropped by Italian aircraft the next morning. Her gunners shot down an Italian bomber just after noon. Soon after, Rodney opened fire with her main guns on a wave of incoming Italian torpedo bombers, hoping to deter them with shell splashes. Proved intimidating for both the attackers and the escorts. Rodney came under heavy attack throughout the day, and her steering began acting up around 2 p.m. Despite her engineers' efforts to keep it operational, Rodney faced another assault at 6:42 p.m. by Stuka dive bombers from the Italian Air Force. 1 armor-piercing bomb struck X turret, wounding 4 Royal Marines, while 2 others detonated nearby. These evasive maneuvers further aggravated the steering issues and caused problems with her boilers. At the time Force Z turned back, Rodney's top speed was limited to 18 knots. She arrived at Gibraltar on August 14th, where temporary repairs were made before heading back to Scapa Flow 2 days later. However, the return voyage proved difficult, as rough weather stressed her steering motors and worsened her leaks. On August 22nd, she was sent to Rosyth for more extensive repairs. Once her repairs were completed on September 16th, Rodney returned to Scapa Flow by September 23. She immediately set sail for Loch Cairnbawn, where the British had set up a replica of Tirpitz's defenses. Rodney was used as a target for frogman training with chariot-man torpedoes in preparation for Operation Tidal. She returned to Scapa on September 29th and spent most of October preparing for the upcoming invasion of North Africa. Winston Churchill visited the ship on October 10th to thank the crew for their efforts during Operation Pedestal. On October 23rd, Rodney set sail for Gibraltar, rejoining Force H upon arrival. During the landings at Algiers and Oran in November, Force H was tasked with providing distant cover in case the Vichy French Navy or the Italian Navy attempted to intervene. If no naval threat emerged, Rodney was to support the Center Naval Task Force at Oran on November 8th. While other ships dealt with the warships in the port of Mers el-Kabir, Rodney targeted the four 7.6-inch coastal defense guns at Fort du Santon, which overlooked the harbor. She fired 16 shells, but had to withdraw after a submarine threat was reported. The French guns remained silent during her bombardment. Rodney resumed firing later that afternoon without response from the fort. The following morning, as she closed in, the French guns opened fire, nearly hitting the ship. Rodney pulled back and continued her bombardment with the help of a land-based spotter. While the shelling did not significantly impact the fort, Rodney continued firing at the French guns, which were targeting advancing American forces. Fort surrendered shortly after. 1943, HMS Rodney remained stationed in the Mediterranean until May 7, 1943, when she left for Devonport to undergo a brief refit. The work lasted until May 28, after which she sailed to Scapa Flow, arriving on June 3. Once there, she began training for the upcoming invasion of Sicily, known as Operation Husky. After completing her training, Rodney rejoined Force H but did not engage in combat during the landings. While berthed at Grand Harbor in Malta, the ship endured numerous air raids, though she emerged unscathed. On August 31st, Rodney joined Nelson in bombarding coastal defense positions near Reggio di Calabria in preparation for Operation Baytown, the Allied crossing of the Strait of Messina from Sicily. During this bombardment, Rodney's fire hit and destroyed an ammunition dump. Following this, Force H played a key role in supporting the Allied landings at Salerno, known as Operation Avalanche, on September 9th. Although Rodney did not use her main guns, her anti-aircraft weapons were deployed to defend against air attacks during the landings. On September 25th, Captain Robert Fitzroy took over command of Rodney from Captain Rivet Carnac. Shortly after, on November 5th, the battleship returned to the UK and rejoined the home fleet. In late December, while at sea conducting a night gunnery exercise alongside the French battleship Richelieu, Rodney encountered a severe storm. The ship sustained weather damage, resulting in extensive flooding in the forward sections of the vessel. 1944 and the Normandy Landings. On January 16, 1944, HMS Rodney left Scapa Flow and headed to Rosyth for repairs. Although her persistent steering and boiler problems were not fully addressed, focus was on making the ship seaworthy again. The repairs were completed by March 28th, and Rodney returned to Scapa on April 1st. Over the next few months, the ship underwent extensive gunnery training, focusing on both shore bombardments and anti-aircraft drills, as well as practicing defense against E-boat attack. Initially, Rodney was held in reserve for the Normandy Landings, also known as Operation Overlord. However, on June 6, 1944, the ship fired her 16-inch armor-piercing shells at coastal defense guns near Le Havre. That same night, Rodney was ordered to move forward to support operations near Sword Beach. During the approach, she accidentally collided with and sank landing craft LCT-427, tragically killing all 13 crewmen on board. In the darkness and crowded waters off the Isle of Wight, another landing craft struck Rodney's bow, causing a 9-foot hole in her hull and damaging the bow of the landing craft. Once in position, Rodney began targeting German forces north of Seine, possibly units of the 12th SS Panzerdivision Hitlerjugend that were attacking British and Canadian troops. By the end of the day, the ship had fired 99 16-inch and 132 6-inch shells. To avoid further attacks by German light forces, Rodney moved to safer waters off Juno Beach for the night. On June 8th, she returned to Sword Beach, where she bombarded German troops and vehicles around Seine. The following day, her guns helped destroy parts of the city, including the spire of the Church of Saint Pierre, and she also targeted coastal defense positions, Holgate and Bennerville-sur-Mer. After a brief air raid, Rodney withdrew to Milford Haven to replenish her ammunition. Rodney remained in reserve until June 18th, when Nelson struck a mine and had to withdraw from operations. A severe storm hit the area the next day, halting all operations. Rodney provided shelter for a landing craft during the storm, and on June 21st, a trawler collided with her, though the damage was minor. On the night of June 23 to 24, Rodney was attacked twice by Junkers Ju-88 bombers, with her gunners claiming to have shot down one. For the first time since her return, Rodney's main guns opened fire during Operation Epsom on June 26. This included a 30-hour bombardment aimed at preventing a panzer division from crossing a key bridge. Rodney continued to provide fire support during Operation Windsor on July 4 to 5, Canadian-led assault on Carpiquet and its airfield. She was also involved in Operation Charnwood on July 8 to 9, a direct attack on Seine. Some of the targets were at the very edge of Rodney's range, so oil was pumped to one side of the ship to give her a temporary list, allowing her guns to reach further. By the end of Operation Charnwood, Rodney was withdrawn as the Allies advanced deeper into France. Over her time supporting the landings, she had fired a total of 519 16-inch and 454 6-inch shells. Later in August, long-range artillery on the German-occupied island of Alderney was interfering with Allied operations off the Cotentin Peninsula. On August 12th, Rodney was tasked with silencing these guns. She bombarded Battery Blucher from the other side of Cap de la Hague to avoid return fire, releasing 75 16-inch shells at the position. It was believed that 3 of the 4 guns had been destroyed. However, post-war analysis revealed that only 1 gun was actually damaged, and it was back in action by November. The other guns resumed firing on Allied ships by the end of August. Post-invasion. After spending 2 weeks in Portland, HMS Rodney arrived at Devonport on August 27th for repairs that were expected to last at least a month. However, her time in the dockyard was cut short when orders came for her to head north. She arrived at Scapa Flow on September 15th, and the very next day, Rodney set sail to escort convoy JW-60s on its journey to Murmansk. The convoy made an uneventful passage, and the escorts dropped anchor at Vanga on September 23rd. 3 days later, Admiral Arseny Golovko visited Rodney to coordinate defense strategies for the convoys. On September 28th, Rodney joined the return convoy RA-60. German submarines managed to sink 2 of the ships in the convoy, but the Germans lost 1 of their own in the process. Rodney and the rest of the convoy safely returned to Scapa Flow on October 5th. Just a few days later, on October 9th, Rodney was appointed the Home Fleet flagship when Admiral Sir Henry Moore raised his flag aboard her. For the next year, Rodney remained stationed at Scapa Flow, with little activity breaking the routine. One memorable occasion was the visit from King George VI, Queen Elizabeth and their daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret, in late September 1945. In mid-November, Rodney left Scapa and headed south to Portsmouth, where Admiral Moore transferred his flag to her sister ship. By December 2nd, Rodney had arrived at Rosyth, where she was placed in No. 3 dry dock from December 8th until March 1st, 1948. During this period, her condition was assessed and the ship's leaks were patched up. Early that year, Rodney was transferred to Biscoe for disposal, and on March 26, 1948, she was allocated to those W. Ward for scrapping at Inverkeithing. HMS Rodney's story is one of resilience, strength, and service through some of the most critical moments in naval history. From her early days of patrolling the Atlantic to her pivotal role in the pursuit and destruction of the mighty Bismarck, Rodney was at the forefront of many significant events during World War II. She endured constant challenges, steering problems, structural damage, and fierce battles, yet she continued to serve valiantly. Whether bombarding coastal defenses during the Normandy landings or defending vital convoys, Rodney's contributions were invaluable to the Allied war effort. Her journey through Operation Halberd, her time with Force H, and her support during the invasions of Sicily and Italy all showcased her firepower and strategic importance. And even in the later stages of the war, From protecting Arctic convoys to engaging in long-range bombardments, Rodney proved her value time and again. But like all great ships, her time came to an end. After years of hard service, including repairs and a final period as Home Fleet flagship, HMS Rodney was decommissioned and eventually scrapped in 1948. Her legacy, however, lives on as a reminder of the vital role battleships played in shaping the outcome of World War II. As we look back on Rodney's career, we remember the crews who sailed her through turbulent seas, fierce combat, and moments of triumph. Their dedication and sacrifice ensure that HMS Rodney will forever hold a place in the annals of naval history.